Good afternoon. We are continuing on with chapter 11. Last time we talked about the flower industry with Charles Pillsbury. So we did Pillsbury and the flower. Today we are doing the lumber industry with Frederick Weyerhaeuser. So we're starting on page 225 with Frederick Weyerhaeuser and the lumber industry. Okay, so on our comprehension page, you filled in that top part for the flower industry. We're doing the same idea with the lumber industry. So we're going to be listening for natural resources, at least 3. People and jobs, at least 3. Machines, at least 3. And then our number 4 question is, why did the lumber industry decline in Minnesota? We're going to fill that in when we get to the end of this section. So let's listen about Frederick Weyerhaeuser.
Frederick Weyerhaeuser and the lumber industry. Frederick Weyerhaeuser was already a rich and successful businessman by the time he invested in Minnesota's lumber industry. Weyerhaeuser had grown up in Germany and immigrated to the United States in 1852 at the age of 18. After working for several years in a series of jobs, he and a partner risked almost all the money they had to buy a sawmill in Illinois. That sawmill was the first piece of a lumber empire that eventually spread across much of the northwestern United States.
So remember, James J. Hill was an empire builder because he had his hand in all these different industries. So Frederick Weyerhaeuser is in the lumber industry, but he makes an empire out of it because he doesn't just do the sawmill. We're going to see how he spreads and does more than just owning a sawmill.
Weyerhaeuser realized early on that a successful lumber business depended on a reliable supply of logs. He also realized that the best way to make sure the logs kept coming was to own the forest that produced the logs. In the 1860s, he started buying timberland in Wisconsin. When most of the white pine there had been harvested, he turned his attention to Minnesota.
So he's got the sawmill. Well, what do you need to make money in a sawmill? You need the logs. So he goes, well, I want to get those logs. Where did the logs come from? Trees. So he's buying the land where the trees are. That white pine is the prize trees that they wanted. So he's buying all the white pine forests. Well, how am I going to get my logs from the forest to the sawmill? Well, I'm going to own that railway going from the forest to the sawmill. So he's buying up all the parts to that lumber industry. So he owns it all, so he's making all that profit. So instead of just sitting at the sawmill saying, bring me your logs, he's making sure he gets those logs. And that's how he's building that empire.
In 1890, Weyerhaeuser and his partners purchased more than 200,000 acres of timberland in the central part of the state. He eventually expanded his business in Minnesota to sawmills and small railroad lines. This gave him power over every step of the lumbering process, so he could tightly control costs and profits. By 1900, more than 400 lumber companies, including several belonging to Weyerhaeuser, were operating in the state, and Minnesota ranked 3rd in the nation in lumber production. Towns and cities throughout the Midwest were built using Minnesota lumber.
So Weyerhaeuser started with the sawmill in Illinois. Then he bought up that land in Wisconsin to get the logs to Illinois. But then he's using up all the trees in Wisconsin. So he says, I need more trees. Well, let's shift over to Minnesota. Minnesota, we know, had all that great farmland in the south and in the western parts. But what's in northern Minnesota? Forests. Yeah, there's all those forests. You go up to Duluth, you go up north to the cabin, you see trees everywhere. So Weyerhaeuser is saying, Minnesota is rich with all of those trees. Let's shift everything to Minnesota now. Instead of keeping that sawmill in Illinois, and having to transport those trees from northern Minnesota all the way to Illinois, he's saying, well, let's get some sawmills in Minnesota, so I don't have to transport my logs so far. So he's getting the land, he's getting that railway, he's getting the sawmills all in Minnesota, so he can make more and more profit.
Lumber industry essentials. The lumber industry relied on the same basic essentials as the flour industry. Investment from business owners such as Weyerhaeuser was combined with natural resources, machines, and people. Though logging in Minnesota had begun in the late 1830s, it wasn't until the 1880s that lumber companies started making major investments to cut down trees and produce lumber on a large scale.
We're gonna see why our lumber industry kind of exploded at the end of the 1800s. Just like the flour industry got huge, King Wheat came on board, right? We were able to make lots of flour, Pillsbury really flourished. We're gonna see why the lumber industry kind of exploded and why it got so big and they were able to make so money. Just like with the flour industry, we need to find those natural resources that we use with the lumber industry. What's the first natural resource that you can think of that we would need for the lumber industry? Michael? The logs. Logs come from what? Trees. So trees. And we're gonna see what kind of tree was the very specific tree that they wanted that Minnesota had a lot of. And then we're gonna hear about other natural resources that are needed.
Natural resources. For hundreds of years, vast forests of white pine, a tree prized for its high-quality lumber, grew in dense stands across much of northern Minnesota. The white pine could grow more than 150 feet tall, and the straight trunks had no branches for many feet above the ground. These straight, strong trees made superior boards for construction.
The trees are super tall, 150 feet. I'm 5'4", well, 6 feet. So at least 10 feet, 12 feet to the ceiling, 150 feet. So that would be like 15 stories. That's how tall these trees are. And on the bottom trunks, going way up, the branches don't start coming out right away. So they have all this straight tree that they can turn into boards to use for construction, straight boards. That's what everybody wanted. They're strong, they're straight, perfect for making those boards.
Rivers and waterfalls were just as important to the lumber industry as they were to the flour milling industry. Rivers served as transportation highways for millions of logs. When they reached the sawmills, the floating logs were collected into a boom, a section of the river that was blocked off to contain the logs. There, inside the boom, workers sorted and stored the logs. Like the flour mills, sawmills were located next to waterfalls so they could use water power to operate machinery.
So the lumber industry began in the 1830s. There's no railroad tracks yet in the 1830s, hasn't gotten here yet. So they need to be able to transport all these logs from the forest to the sawmill. What's the easiest way to transport these super big, heavy logs? On the river, right? So the logging camps are set up near rivers where they can cut it down and just use horses to drag the logs over to the river, roll it into the river, and then they float down the river to where the sawmill is. So those rivers were very vital to the lumber industry. They would pack the rivers full of logs, floating them down. I'm still talking. Hey, you gotta just listen, be patient. We'll get to it. So the rivers are an important part of that lumber industry because that's how they transported, especially before the railroads came. Then when we get down a little bit farther, it says not only were the rivers important, but just like the flour industry wanted waterfalls, waterfalls are important. So it's two different natural resources. One is a river, one is a waterfall. Why is the waterfall important to the sawmill? Addie?
They use the water from coming down from the waterfall for energy.
Yeah, they got the power for the saws at the mill from the power of the waterfalls. So that waterfall was important also, so they could use the mills. Yes?
Up by my cabin, there's like an old logging camp
Really?
site, and there's like, there was a river, I don't think it's there anymore, but.
Very cool. Yeah, because those lumber camps, a lot of times in the beginning especially, were by those rivers. So, we've got the white pine trees, we've got rivers are important, we've got waterfalls are important. Look at this picture though. What do you think this is a picture of? Yeah, there's logs. What do we see about those logs? Aiden. They're in the river. Adeline?
They're all cut down.
They're cut down. They were cut down and put into the river. Does it look like they're flowing down the river?
No.
We're gonna see about a big log jam that happened. It's huge, massive. And see what all happened to that. So let's listen.
Welcome to MN90, Minnesota history in 90 seconds.
In June 1886, Taylors Falls, Minnesota was the site of what is still called the mother of all log jams. For weeks, the annual log drive down the St. Croix River was moving slowly because water levels were unusually low. But then, everything changed overnight. As was typical to get the logs moving, a crew upstream had dynamited their dam, sending more logs into the river with a swell of water. At about the same time, a cloudburst hit the St. Croix Valley. That night, the logs rushed down the St. Croix. Historian Edward Nelson says at Taylors Falls, lumbermen asleep in their tents were awakened by a deafening crash. 3,000-pound logs were flying 50 feet into the air.
By the time it was all said and done, there were over 250 million board feet of logs stacked up 7 miles back on the St. Croix River. Everything came to a halt.
It took 200 men working 6 weeks around the clock to free up the mother of all log jams.
MN90 is a co-production of the Minnesota Historical Society and Ambers, diverse radio for Minnesota's communities, made possible by funding from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Online at mn90.org.
So think about what actually happened. The river's running slow because sometimes in April, if it hasn't rained, there's not a lot of water, so the river's going kind of slow. And they're pushing all these logs down and they're getting a little impatient. Come on, we gotta get the logs to the sawmill so we can get paid. So they dynamite, trying to get that water to move faster, right? Along with that making the water move faster, what else happened?
A storm comes.
Big storm comes and fills up the river with all the storm water, plus all the water that was rushing down because they dynamited. And all of a sudden, all these logs were going too fast. And the log jam happened, and the logs kept piling on top of each other. If you were listening carefully, as the logs are crashing into each other, how high did these logs fly into the air?
50 feet.
50 feet. Remember I said it's, maybe a little more than 10 feet? So 50 stories. Right? That's how these logs that were, I forget how many,
150 feet.
know how much it weighed. So these huge logs that weigh, like they said, thousands of pounds. One log was thousands of pounds, flies in the air 50 feet, and they all come crashing down. Can you imagine sleeping at the camp that's near the river and hearing that crash? Woo! I'd be scared that the logs were gonna fly onto me. Thankfully, they all flew onto the river, but that river was backed up 7 miles. It took them 6 weeks to get rid of that log jam. 200 men working around the clock That is a huge log jam that backed everything up. It's kind of a fun little interesting story. All right, so now we're on to the machines. We learned in the lumber industry, or in the flour industry, about the new machines that helped make things go more efficiently to get the better flour that people really wanted. So let's see what kind of machines did they use that they kept using, and what were some of the new things that they added in.
Machines. Crosscut saws, axes, logging chains, and hooks had long been important tools of the lumber trade. However, as the years went on, people invented new machines to make the business more efficient. Hot water pumps kept the water near sawmills from freezing so that mills could run all winter. Faster steam-powered saws with circular blades helped increase lumber production.
So they're using saws and axes and all of that at the lumber camp. But then they're starting to find things for the sawmill, just like the flour mill. What can we do to make it go quicker, more efficiently? So they added the hot water pumps to keep it so they wouldn't freeze up in the wintertime when it gets cold overnight. We saw what spring is like in Minnesota. We think it's spring, the water's flowing, but then it snows again and things freeze. So they're trying to prevent those saws from freezing. We've got the steam-powered saws with the circular blades that really help increase how much they can cut. James?
It's like a crosscut saw and like axes. Do you think those are machines?
Those are machines, yes. They're not high-powered machines, but the beginning machines, those are machines. Okay, so not only do we need to know that they're using those saws and axes and those logging chains, but we also need to know about the new machines that helped that lumber industry grow. Aside from those machines, there was a very important machine that came around in the 1880s that really helped with the flour industry. It really helped with settling western Minnesota. What machine could this be, Harper? The train. Remember, those logging camps had to be set up by the rivers because they had to drag the logs to the river to send it down to the sawmill. But now we have trains coming. What does the train open up for the lumber industry?
Transportation.
That transportation. Now they can go farther away from the rivers. They just have to be close to the train tracks. They just have to drag those logs to the trains, and then the trains will bring them down to the sawmills. So they're not limited by where the rivers are. So now all that land, just like western Minnesota opened up for the farmers to be able to ship their crops in farther away, the lumber industry now can have forests that are nowhere near the water, as long as they can use those trains to ship their logs.
Few improvements, however, were as important as the railways. At first, most logs were hauled to rivers by horses and floated downstream to the mills. As more and more timber was cut, it became more difficult to find pine forests near rivers. In the 1890s, lumber companies started using trains to move logs out of forests that weren't near rivers. They often built temporary tracks used only to haul out the massive pine logs. After all the logs in an area were shipped out, the tracks would be moved to the next forest.
So they would move the train to where they were going to have their lumber camp. So they would clear out one area and then move the train to the next area that they wanted. So now we're on to the people. Who is the most important person that we need to put in there? Robbie? Frederick Weyerhaeuser, right? He's the one that had the lumber empire. So we want to remember Frederick Weyerhaeuser is connected to the lumber industry. We're going to hear about lots of other important jobs and the people who worked those jobs.
People. The lumber industry employed lumberjacks in the forests and sawmill workers in cities and towns. During the winter, when the ground was frozen, lumberjacks cut down trees and hauled them away. During the spring, the logs were transported to sawmills. In the early years, workers floated the logs down rivers to sawmills in places like Minneapolis, Stillwater, Red Wing, and Winona. Later, Trains carried the logs to sawmills in cities like Virginia. At the sawmills, workers ran the machines that turned the logs into lumber. Jobs in the lumber industry paid well, but they were often hard and dangerous. It was common for lumberjacks to suffer serious injuries while cutting down trees with axes and saws. Those who helped drive the logs downriver had to be careful not to fall in the water where they could drown or be crushed. The mills, with their whirring saw blades, were dangerous places too.
So think about the flour industry, right? When you were working at the flour mill and you're working on that middling purifier, the new machine, was that a high-paying job or a low-paying job? Why was it high-paying, Adeline? Because it was dangerous. They didn't have the safety features. They didn't know how to use it the best way yet because it was a new machine. Same thing with the lumber industry. Those sawmills are getting new things. They've got those big circular saws now. It's dangerous. Not only is the sawmill dangerous work, being a lumberjack is dangerous. Cutting down those trees, 150-foot tall tree, right? You have to be careful. Where is that tree going to fall? 150 feet is a long distance. You need to make sure that you are far away from where that tree is falling. You don't want that 150-foot tree to fall on you. That would not be good. Lumberjacks had to ride on the logs down the stream. Do those logs just float like a raft down the stream and you're just standing there?
No.
What are the logs doing? Yeah, they're moving. They're rolling. And you're standing on the log and you're trying to balance yourself. Okay? That log gets bumped by another log and you get jostled, you might fall in the water. What's in the water?
Logs.
Lots of logs. Very, very heavy logs. You fall in the water, you run the risk of getting trapped under the logs and drowning. You run the risk of the logs crushing you into each other. Right? So it was a dangerous job. So it was high paying because you were risking a lot. Right? So now we come to that question number 4. Why does the lumber industry start declining? Any guesses? Why do you think, Christina? Okay, it starts to get colder, you're not going to want to work out in the cold. Why do you think, Alex?
All the trees get cut down.
Think about what happened in Wisconsin. Frederick Weyerhaeuser started out in Wisconsin, cut down all those trees, so he moved to Minnesota. You cutting down all the trees, do they just 150-foot tree grow in a couple months? No, it takes a long time for the tree to get that big. So he's cutting down all the big trees. At this point in time, they hadn't learned to plant new trees. So he's cutting down trees, the trees are going away. Let's listen about that.
By 1910, lumber production in Minnesota was beginning to decline. Minnesotans started talking seriously about conserving trees and planting new ones, but by then it was too late. Many sawmills in Minnesota were closing. Logging operations were moving west to forests that had not yet been cut down. Men who wanted to continue working as lumberjacks had to follow the companies west. Others turned to harvesting different kinds of trees, and the rest had to find new work. Once it was clear that Minnesota was running out of white pine, Frederick Weyerhaeuser left and moved his business operations to the state of Washington.
So just like he cleaned out Wisconsin, moved to Minnesota, now he's cutting down all the trees in Minnesota, so he's gonna move out west. Right? When I see this picture, I always think of a certain Dr. Seuss book. Any guess what book I always think of? Natalie?
The Lorax.
The Lorax. Right, remember the Lorax was fighting for the truffle trees. Right, everybody's cutting down the truffle trees because they want to make the needs. Right, and all the trees go away. What happens to the area once all the truffle trees were chopped down? James?
It's more polluted.
Gets polluted. What else?
All the animals go away.
Why did all the animals have to leave?
We had no trees or that home.
Yeah, the trees were their home. 150-foot tall tree. Do you think one little squirrel lives in that big old tree? No, there's lots of animals that use those trees. Right? So cutting down the trees causes a big problem. So people were, in Minnesota, were starting to say, hey, we need to conserve our trees. We need to stop clear cutting all these trees. We need to keep some. We need to plant more. You cut down a tree, you plant a tree. It's not gonna grow to be 150 foot tall overnight, but it's going to grow and replace what you cut down. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, was he so concerned about that? No, because he says, oh, I'm just gonna move my operation to a new state. And he's just moving on so he can keep making that money. Okay, so you should have been able to fill in all three parts of our circle and answer that question number 4. Now, we're gonna go back to something we skipped last time. So we're gonna go back to that big green box that was in the middle of the lumber industry.
Please excuse this interruption. These are your Tuesday afternoon announcements. Reminder, if you have sold any tuition raffle tickets, please turn those into the office. Friday is the last day to turn in any top tabs that you've collected, so remember to collect those and get those turned in before Friday. Golf is today for those that have signed up for golf. If you are someone who's supposed to stay after for golf, please meet right outside the gym. Your instructors will meet you there. And lastly, there is track practice today. You will also meet right outside of the gym for your 2 o'clock practice. Track is today. Meet right outside the gym for 2 o'clock practice. That is all I have for you. Remember to be kind, be brave, believe, be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Have a wonderful Tuesday evening.
Page 221 is our green box. It is the sidebar for money, goods, and services. Look at your comprehension page on the back side. Sidebar, money, goods, and services at the bottom. Okay, so that's all coming from this green sidebar. We've seen a little flow chart like this before. In our last chapter, we saw something like this. So we have our households and we have our businesses. Last time we saw it was the plantations in the south and the factories in the north. How do they help each other out? Now we're going to see how the households and businesses help each other.
So what? Money, goods, and services going round and round. Your household is part of the economy in Minnesota. Here's one way to think of it. Picture an ongoing cycle or continuous circle of money and goods and services. Every time you buy a good or service, your household gives money to a business for it. Every time someone from your household goes to work, his or her employer, a business, gives money to your household. The work being done is one example of a resource. In this case, a human resource rather than a natural resource.
So in a resource market, what is going into the businesses? Nolan? What are the people doing for the business? They're working. So then what goes into the household? If the people are working, what are they bringing home, Eleanor? Their wages. They're getting money for working, right? So they're putting in work into the business, and the business is giving them a salary, giving them wages, giving them money. So then we look at the product market. What do the businesses have? What goes into the business? What are we giving to the business, Addie? Money. And what are we getting from the businesses?
Goods and services.
Goods and services. I go to Target, I give them my money, and I get my products, right? I get my groceries. I get all the good stuff that you can get at Target. So, how did this cycle help Minnesota's economy to grow during the time of flour milling, lumbering, and iron mining?
Now, let's take this idea and apply it to the 3 industries below. They helped Minnesota's economy grow because households across the state, the nation, and the world paid money for the goods these industries provided. At the same time, businesses paid workers from many Minnesota households to produce the goods the households were buying. Are businesses and households still connected in the same way today?
So think about it. What's happening to the economy in Minnesota? We haven't done the iron mining yet, but we've done flour, we've done the lumber. What's happening? As the railroad tracks are coming in, What's happening to the flower industry? It's getting huge. What's happening to the lumber industry? It's getting huge. So it's not just Charles Pillsbury and Frederick Weyerhaeuser making all the money. They're making all these jobs for Minnesotans. So these Minnesotans are getting jobs, which means they're getting money, and they're gonna buy stuff, right? I go to the store and I buy cake mix and pancake mix. That's from Pillsbury. I buy his flour. So that is, I'm giving my money to Pillsbury and I'm getting products from him. I'm working for him and he's giving me money and I use that money to buy the products, so he needs to make more and I get more money working for him so I can buy more, right? So as that business is growing, the economy is growing because people are getting jobs, they're getting paid, they're using it to buy the stuff. So let's see what it says about flour and lumber.
Flour milling. Households spend money on flour. Workers at companies such as Pillsbury get paid to produce flour. Lumber. Households buy lumber to build new homes. Lumberjacks and sawmill workers get paid by owners like Weyerhaeuser to cut timber and process the lumber. Iron mining. Households buy goods manufactured with steel, which is made from iron. Miners get paid by companies such as U.S. Steel to mine iron. Factory workers get paid to help turn it into steel.
So as the industries get bigger, there's more workers making more money, buying more of the industry's products, so the industry gets bigger and they get more workers who gets buy more products, and that's how the economy grows. So Minnesota's economy was growing a lot during this time. Industry's getting bigger, more money, everything's getting bigger. So at this point, we have done the whole front side, flour industry, lumber industry, and on the back side, we've done the bottom part with that sidebar talking about the economy. Tomorrow, we're gonna talk about the iron mining industry. So we'll fill in that last section. Tomorrow, we'll start working on that. Shh. If you are watching this at home, I hope you are well and hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.